Ena mana, ena reo, raurango terma, tena koto, tena koto, tena koto kato. For those of you who do not know me, my name is Hema Sridhar. I'm the Deputy Director here at Koitu, the Centre for Informed Future. It is my great pleasure this afternoon to welcome you on this very important webinar where I'll be joined by Georgia Lala, Paul Spoonley and Sir Peter Gluckman to discuss two reports that we recently released. Before we get into these two reports, if you don't know about us, Koitu, we are an independent, non-partisan, future-focused think tank, and we're dedicated to tackling the long-term issues and challenges that shape not just New Zealand, but are issues that matter globally as well. We are based on evidence and we provide high-quality, data-driven insights to address critical issues that matter to all of us here in New Zealand as well as globally. We were launched in 2020, founded by Sir Peter Gluckman, following many decades of advice, particularly at the interface of science and society. We work closely with experts, not just in New Zealand, but also internationally. And we have quite a strong team of expertise that we can bring in on a range of issues, from climate change right the way through to social cohesion, technology, and foresight. So for this webinar today, in April and May this year, Koitu released two pieces of work on our changing demographic. And these two reports, the first report, People, Place and Prosperity, outlines how New Zealand needs a long-term and non-partisan population strategy to prepare for major demographic shifts, including an aging population, declining fertility, migration flows, and uneven regional growth. The second commentary, Brain Drain or Business as Usual, looking past the headlines, examines whether recent migration trends represent a sudden crisis or a return to historical patterns or a more complex story. As I said before, we're joined today by the three authors of these two reports. And we will begin today with Georgia Lala, who's a fellow here at Koitu, followed by a senior fellow, Paul Spoonley, and of course, our managing director, Sir Peter Gluckman. So I will begin by handing over to Georgia, who would give us a bit of an outline of these two reports.
Awesome. Thank you, Hema. Great. Ko kia ora koutou, ko Georgia taku ingoa. So to do a bit of scene setting for these two reports, New Zealand's demography is rapidly changing across multiple key dimensions. Today, I'm going to talk about 5 of the different demographic shifts that are highlighted in these two papers. But what's important to highlight, I think, first up, is that these shifts are neither new nor unprecedented. We've actually known about them for a while. But despite this, we still have no long-term strategy to navigate the challenges and leverage the opportunities that I'm going to talk about today. So after this section, I'm going to pass to Professor Paul Spoonley, who's going to talk a little bit about, frankly, why we struggle with long-term planning in New Zealand and the case for a population strategy in this country. So to start us off, to talk about the first demographic trend, like many countries around the world, New Zealand is experiencing a rapid falling fertility rate. We're currently sitting at a fertility rate of around 1.53. For context sitting here, a fertility rate of 2.1 is needed to maintain a population. That's putting immigration to one side, meaning that every couple, every woman in New Zealand has to have roughly around 2 children. So I hope that puts in context sort of where we are in that trajectory. The other thing to note here is that we can expect this number to continue to fall in the future, and that's due to a range of complex factors across economic, cultural, and social reasons that I really think can be summed up by we're living in a time of deep uncertainty, and that is impacting our fertility rate. Immediately, a falling fertility rate signals three big challenges for our country. The first is a shrinking workforce. As fewer people are born and others continue to exit out of the workforce, our country is going to struggle to maintain that size of the workforce. Business New Zealand predicts that by 2045, our country is going to face a labour shortage of around 250,000 people, to put that in perspective. The second thing to note here is that with fewer babies being born, we're going to have smaller education cohorts. So primary school roles are forecasted to decrease by around 7% in just 8 years, and secondary school roles are forecast to decrease by 6%. That's going to require real structural changes to how we both fund and, frankly, do education. The last implication here to talk about is a aging population as the proportion of younger people relative to older people shrink. That kind of conveniently brings me to the second demographic factor I want to talk about today, which is an aging population. By 2048, nearly 1/4 of the population will be over the age of 65. So that's rising from 17% in 2025 to 22% in 2048. So what you're seeing in this graph is basically a shift in the median age over time, with that population bulge moving towards the right of the graph, reflecting older age. We're also seeing a thickening sort of proportion of that 65 plus tail, as well as an elongating 85 plus tail as people live longer. I guess it's important to say up front that it's amazing that people are living longer and healthier lives. The other thing to consider, though, is that an aging population obviously brings with it a number of implications. These include a shifting dependency ratio, which means that we're reliant on a smaller portion of tax-paying adults to fund our public services. It's important to note here that older folk are staying in the workforce longer now, but even with that shift, we're still seeing a change in the dependency ratio that's likely to continue. The second implication to talk about here is growing healthcare needs. The Treasury says on average that a person over the age of 65 costs our public healthcare system 5 times the amount of the average person under the age of 65. And the average person over the age of 85 is 5 times that. There's also the obvious challenge here of superannuation, which I know a lot of people have already said a lot about. The one thing that I'll say here is that the cost of superannuation is expected to increase from 5.1% of GDP now up to 8% of GDP in 2065. And so that's obviously something that we need to talk about. The next demographic change that I do want to talk about today is that we are becoming increasingly ethnic diverse. By 2043, those who identify as New Zealand European or Pākehā are forecasted to fall from 65% of the population to 55% of the population. In contrast to that, those who identify as Asian will increase from 21% to 31%. As with all trends, this has its own implications. The first there is the regional variation in diversity. So Auckland, for example, is experiencing a much faster evolution in ethnic diversity, and that creates a very unique regional identity. And that's great for social, cultural, and economic initiatives that reflect our unique demographic makeup. But it's also complicated for policymaking, particularly if national policies don't reflect Auckland's multicultural makeup with its different infrastructure, healthcare, and different social needs. Ethnic diversity and diversity in general also brings with it a lot of opportunities in terms of innovation and diversity of thought, but that can only be realized so long as we remove barriers to equal opportunity. If we don't address underlying anxieties and prejudices, we can risk fracture and division. This rather neatly brings me to trends regarding immigration. So as you can see from the graph, in the past 5 years, immigration numbers have been pretty volatile. But in light of falling fertility and an aging population, immigration actually plays a really crucial role in maintaining our population and our workforce. That is obviously putting to one side the implications around workforce innovation. Additionally, though, immigrants play a huge role in industries like medicine, teaching, and technology. In 2021, for example, migrants made up 40% of the 5,000 nurses employed in the aged care sector, and that's according to the New Zealand Productivity Commission. All that said, though, volatile immigration raises questions around whether we can continue to attract international talent. Many countries are facing similar trends of falling birth rates and aging population, as New Zealand is facing, and are thus also reliant on immigrants. So what and how can New Zealand continue to attract immigrants overseas? A fun but not so fun fact is that since 2015, our country has fallen in the Global Talent Competitive Index from 11th to 18th. What this says is that New Zealand may actually struggle to continue to attract and retain the people that we need in this country. Finally, in this section, I do want to touch on immigration and the ongoing brain drain debate, which you've more than likely heard in the news. So it is true that in the past 5 years, New Zealand has seen an increase in both overall and youth departures from the country. But what I would really like to say today is that regardless of whatever demographic trend you're looking at, it's extremely important that we look at both the historical, but also the cultural context. So when we zoom out to the 1950s, for example, which you'll see on the left, New Zealand has experienced waves of immigration, and these waves often coincide with economic conditions, which is pretty unsurprising. The other thing to note is that what we're experiencing right now might not even be the peak of citizen immigration. For another thing, though, temporary migration has always been a part of Kiwi culture in the form of that famous Kiwi OE. Kiwis can go overseas and do go overseas and come back with new skills and experience that can benefit our country. But that's not to say that we shouldn't be concerned. On the graph on the right, you'll see that in the past 5 years, citizen departures are suddenly widely eclipsing arrivals. What we don't know, however, is this a bounce back from COVID? Is this a response to economic trends? Or is this actually representative of a shift towards more long-term immigration? We frankly right now just don't know. So rather than questioning, are we having a brain drain crisis? Maybe we should be actually asking what is consistently enticing Kiwis away since the 1950s? And if they're leaving, how do we bring them back to our country? If there's one thing that I can say about demographic trends before passing over to Professor Paul Spoonley, it's that we need to move beyond simplistic and siloed demographic narratives and actually think critically about the issues and their implications. In several of the cases, we have the demographic data and we know the future. So it's actually using it and thinking about long-term and thinking about our future. I'm now going to pass over to Paul Spoonley. He's going to talk a little bit more about the implications and the case for a population policy for New Zealand.
Thank you, Georgia. Kia ora tata katoa. As Georgia has explained, and as we've set out in detail in our report, is that a very new demography is beginning to emerge in New Zealand. The dynamics are different, the drivers are different, but the outcomes are going to be different. And when you think about our current policy settings, many of those have evolved over the last 50 years, in fact, in some cases longer. And the question becomes, will those policy settings operate and anticipate what is required in this new environment? And I think our answer as the authors is a very large and resounding no. So what's happening to our communities in our country? And so George has indicated what those might be. I would add one thing, and which is that I would talk about a new demography, that the country in its shape and where we live, our cultural diversity, the numbers aged over 65 compared to those under 15, are all going to be quite different from what they are in the past. So what are the implications for our policy landscape? What do we need to do to adjust to this new environment? Do we understand all of the trends and the outcomes that are going to emerge? Thank you, Georgia. So I'm going to actually refer back to what I thought was an excellent report that appeared in September last year, a Tirahanga Mokopuna, which interestingly enough, I would translate as what are the implications for our grandchildren, which I think is a very interesting framing of that. Treasury rightly is focused on some of the structural pressures and processes, and particularly on what's going to happen in terms of our current fiscal settings. And I would add that our demography, even given the volatility of immigration that Georgia highlighted, our demography over the next 10 years and 20 years is actually pretty well known. We know what's going to happen in terms of fertility decline. We know the numbers and the size of the aging population. We do probably need to improve our understanding in some areas, and Georgia highlighted the very significant data gap, which you can see in terms of those emigrating from New Zealand. I mean, the arrival and departure cards used to give us some insight into why people left, why they came back. And of course, we don't have those anymore. And what this quote from Treasury has indicated is that there are a series of other things which are converging and intensifying. So what are the impacts on the country, and in this case for Treasury, on the finances over the next 40 years? What are going to be the costs? What are going to be the benefits? What are going to be the opportunities? Thank you. And this is something that we feel very strongly at Koitu, and that is that these changes are underway at the moment. Some of them began a little over a decade ago. If you look at our fertility decline, as we came out of the global financial crisis in 2012, it was still at replacement level fertility, began to decline in 2013, really picked up around 2015, 2016, a little bit of a halt during COVID, but again, we're seeing year on year a decline in fertility. And so we've got those things that are already beginning to impact upon, as again, Georgia has said, for example, the numbers enrolled in our primary schools. So we can reduce the impacts, but also the cost of change, which is the point that Treasury are making here, if we start sooner, and we're suggesting that moment is now, and rather than react or contribute to disruptive changes when we hit a particular wall. The point that is made here, which I want to repeat, which the Minister of Finance made during some of the discussion around the budget this year, and that is the question of intergenerational equity. And here, Treasury have identified these as spreading the cost, the transition costs, over generations. We do not want to halt what is provided to one generation or expect another generation to suddenly pay for some of those costs. Thank you very much. So here's a headline from Radio New Zealand, but here's a graphic that relates to some of the Treasury comments. This graph has been slightly misinterpreted by some. It is actually what are called the entry and exit years. So the numbers in the paid workforce compared to those not in the paid workforce, beg your pardon, not entry, but the numbers in paid work. Of course, the 65 is increasingly no longer the age of retirement, so we need to be careful about the assumptions here. But what it shows you is that those potentially working and potentially paying income tax, personal income tax, compared to those over 65, and therefore we would assume in receipt of superannuation, has gone from 7 to 1 to currently 4 to 1, and will eventually be 2 to 1. So those ratios, what we elsewhere call in the literature the old age ratio, dependency ratios, suddenly changes the whole dynamics in this case between generations, as those baby boomers, millennials, Generation X, millennials and Generation X pay for the baby boomers to enjoy their superannuation, and then, of course, future generations. So that's one aspect that is really beginning to focus our attention, as it should. And the question becomes then, what do we need to do to respond to this new demography? Thank you, Georgia. A lot of it is focused on the growing gap between those who are available to work in our labour market and then, of course, the very large number that are exiting. So those entry-exit ratios that I mentioned a wee while ago are not equal, and we're seeing a very large group. They might not exit the labour force at age 65, but they certainly will exit the labour force sometime in their 60s, 70s, or even 80s. And at the other end of the spectrum, those very much smaller cohorts that we're seeing contributing to primary school decline will mean ultimately that the two will begin to diverge. And so rightly, the OECD and in this case, a McKinsey report are talking about the dependency ratios, which is what the McKinsey report is talking about there, but also the possibility of depopulation. And New Zealand is quite a long way behind many other countries, so we're not going to see the depopulation that countries like China, Japan, Germany, Hungary, Italy, Greece have seen in recent years. That's in the future, but we will echo and parallel what's happening in those communities. Thank you, George. There are two things I want to do by way of finishing what I'm going to contribute here. One of these is looking at the very different demography or population of different parts of the community. The blue represents the future shape of the non-Māori population. And what I've done is circled a very significant decline in the number of those aged under 15 in New Zealand. But that is not true for Māori. And Māori, because they have a much different median age profile, because Māori women are still having children at a younger age, having more of them, then what we see is Māori fertility, which is still at replacement level fertility, contributing to a greater proportion of the under 15s in New Zealand who are Māori by self-identification. And so there's a very different demography that's going to emerge. And the outcome is that by 2 decades hence, by the 2040s, a third of all those aged under 15 in New Zealand will be Māori by self-identification. Thank you, Georgia. Now, this is my final slide, but this is some of the scenario modelling that Treasury have been doing in a very interesting paper that is a couple of years old now. And I just want to highlight this because what we need to do is understand what our options are, and not only to react to some of the demographic changes in place, but then to anticipate what should our future demography look like in terms of some of the things that we can manage. This is a scenario modelling exercise. You'll see that the green line is the blue. The blue line is the steady state. I beg your pardon. There are two things that are going on here. One of them is assumptions around migration versus no migration. So migration is one of those levers that we can manage. So what do we want to achieve with that, managing that lever? There are assumptions here about the total fertility rate. So, what will the fertility rate be in the future? If I had to put my guess, I think it'll drop from the current 1.53 births per woman to about 1.2, which is what we see in most of Europe. But we really haven't done a very good job in putting all of these population factors together and then considering where we want to go in terms of this. Can I just end on this one? I mean, one of the assumptions was that in terms of adding another million to our population, the last million that we added to our population, it would take 25 years. In fact, it took 17 years. That is a very significant divergence in terms of what we were anticipating seeing and what actually happened. So all of this suggests that A, we need to become better informed. B, we need to think about what our policy settings are going to be. We need to have a discussion about elements which probably will need to be discussed right across communities, because some of this is quite anxiety inducing. And I think we need to act now, which is the point of Treasury. Kia ora. Thank you.
Well, I'm just going to try and pull this together in a more broader thinking. I think Paul and Georgia have both highlighted the reality that we've known about this for a long time. We've known what's happening, but we sometimes fail in New Zealand to see the wood for the trees all the time. I think one of the things that Koi 2's here to do is to help policymakers see the forest rather than the individual tree. And why I use that analogy is because in general, we look at issues of migration as distinct from issues of the other factors that impact on population, as distinct from the issues of workforce needs, as distinct from the issues of education needs, as distinct particularly from the issues of superannuation and healthcare. And yet all of these are absolutely intertwined, because in the end, every policy, every government department and every community relates to the mix of people you have in the population there. And I think that what we're seeing repeatedly, not just in this election cycle, is different political parties taking short-term positions on rather narrow components of the population story, rather than thinking more broadly about what is New Zealand's long-term goal. How do we ensure that we have the appropriate strategies, whether it's about migration, whether it's about superannuation, whether it's about urbanisation, I'll come to that in a moment, whether it's et cetera, and how do we recognise the growing diversity of population trends across New Zealand, Auckland versus the rest of New Zealand, for example, that are going to have impact on how people live their lives. And I think this is a plea to ask the policy community to take what exists, is well known, and reflect on it more structurally rather than just in short-term issues. Short-term solutions don't lead to long-term success in this particular area. All the issues we face are common across the developed world and increasingly across much of the developing world. The fall in fertility rate is virtually universal in the developed world, which means that the competition for talent, the competition for the appropriate workforce, is going to grow and grow and grow. And of course, in that context, New Zealand, with good educational standards, but in some ways perhaps not as attractive as we would like it to be, has to play aggressively in the competition better than it does now. The free migration of people, effectively free, between New Zealand and Australia has been there for a long time, and obviously there'll be flows in both directions. But if you think about the fact that about 15% of the population of New Zealanders, maybe 20%, are offshore at any one time, we know very little about their long-term intentions now as opposed to 20 years ago. We don't actually study our diaspora. We don't know what the intent is of people who are leaving New Zealand. Unlike countries like Denmark or Ireland, we actually don't have a diaspora strategy. And yet, as more New Zealanders continue to be offshore for short or long time, they're an asset that we need to take more seriously. I'm not going to dwell at length on the factors that cause these shifts, except to say the evidence is very clear that the falls in fertility rate are not going to be changed by government policy significantly. That's fundamentally driven by a set of cultural norms, and the cultural norms for men and women and the expectations on how they live their lives has shifted dramatically over the last few decades, and particularly very recently in the more digital era. It has more implications than just the number of people in the workforce to support those who are not in the workforce, although that's obviously at the top of the list of worries. Family structures change. What's going to be the demography of families in New Zealand? Who are going to be the grandparents? What are the roles of different generations within our population? These change then the way we live our social lives, the way our emotional lives develop. And so we can't separate these factors as much as some people would like to. The other factor we need to think about is the impact of technologies. Clearly, there's a lot of talk now about AI and its impact on the potential workforce. It will potentially shift the distribution of the workforce we need, but it won't eliminate the kind of workforce we need. And as has already been pointed out, already 40% of our care providers are recent migrants. Other aspects come up as well. We know that different ethnicities have different healthcare burdens. Are we planning for that when we look across the country at the different mix of ethnicities across New Zealand? What's going to happen to rural communities with technologies? If more and more work is done through technology, will the income tax model be the best model for financing public services into the future? Underlying all of this is we've actually had a lot of data. Treasury's talked about it a lot, but there's a gap between what Treasury's talked about and how the the political communities responded. And yet there are important gaps in our data. I think the one that George's brain drain paper highlighted, and which Paul also mentioned, is we don't really know what the intent is of the more recent immigrants from New Zealand. Are they away on just OE, as all of us did in our youth? Are they going away because New Zealand's no longer as attractive for different reasons, be it lifestyle, be it culture, etc., or economic? We just don't know. When will they come back? 1 year, 5 years, never. We need that information if we're going to integrate. And I think one of the sad things we're facing at the moment is, for instance, with the changed approach to the census, are we losing information that we need? In this case, even though the data may have been crude, the lack of knowing what the intent is of New Zealanders when they go overseas, when they leave New Zealand, which we used to have some information on the little card we used to fill in, has left a knowledge gap. Now, it can be filled in much simpler ways by surveys, etc., but we desperately need the information to know about what the future shape of New Zealand will be, so it can inform aspects of policies ranging from what kind of schools we need, to what kind of training we need, to where we need to give emphasis to the use of technologies, to how our tax system works, to how our superannuation systems works. These are all things that are linked to what happens to the population policy. And I'll stop there and leave it, Emma, to the Q&A session.
Kia ora, Peter and Paul Spoonley. We're going to move to the Q&A section now, as Peter mentioned. So if there are questions that you would like to ask the panel, please do drop them in. Reading from the questions that have been asked, the question that I'll pose to the panel is really, how do these demographic trends and patterns compare to other OECD countries? Is New Zealand alone in our struggles, or are we one part of a bigger puzzle?
Look, I think you read any paper from the OECD, The Economist, every Western or developed country and many middle income countries are facing the same challenge. Most of them have collapsed their TFR. It seemed to stabilize, go slow, and now it's accelerated even faster in most of the developed world. It's down below 1 in the case of Korea. It's close to 1, the TFR in Singapore, Italy, etc., etc. And we see no reason, Paul or I, given that the drivers relate to many things, but particularly to change in the social norms and how societies operate and the expectations that both men and women have in the way they'll live their lives, that it will shift upwards. And the various attempts that countries have naively made to stimulate and change reproductive patterns just don't work. And it's been tried in both democratic and less democratic countries. And quite clearly, people have control over the way they wish to live their lives. And they have the capacity to do so. And all, for many reasons, that's led to the collapse. Even in New Zealand, and Paul didn't mention it, we've seen parallel declines in all the ethnicities, in Maori, Pacifica, Asian, and traditional European New Zealanders, particularly over the last 10 years. The only difference is they start from different levels. So where Maori, for example, were well above the 2.1 replacement rate a decade ago, they're now just at it or just below it. And similarly, Polynesians are well above it, but they're falling and coming down quite rapidly. So this is sociological and broader. And I think that means, and we're seeing it quite aggressively, competition around the world for workforce is starting to emerge, for talented workforce, the kind of workforce we need. And even in New Zealand, we've for a long time now relied on migration to serve some parts of our workforce needs. And so Paul may want to add, but I think we've got to realise that what's going on here, it can't be fixed just by encouraging men and women to reproduce more.
Thank you. Just to add to what Sir Peter has said, I would add a couple of things. Firstly, if you look at the demographic transition that's occurring, we're probably around 30 years behind the most advanced countries in terms of, particularly of aging and declining fertility. So that would be Germany and Japan. The one thing that is different is that Australia, New Zealand, and Canada all have a particular system of immigration which relies upon a fairly high level of social license to see immigrants in a positive sense, and that's going to be tested in this year's general election. But the second is that we are very carefully select through a point system skilled migrants. So Peter's absolutely right. We're going to have to compete with more and more countries as they struggle to get the skilled workforce that they need, for example, to run their healthcare system. But nevertheless, we do have a system of immigrant recruitment and approval, of settlement, which tends to be very different, for example, to everywhere else in mainland Europe.
We're also very lucky in that regard that our migration is essentially completely formal migration, which is subject as opposed to the informal migration, which has caused a lot of the concerns in Europe. And so we look more like Singapore in that regard, that all our migration is controlled. Now, whether we're controlling it appropriately, and we tend to use very short-term strategies around it, rather than thinking about what we need long-term. But as I said, I would equally look at understanding why New Zealanders leave New Zealand, how long, and understand a bit more about how do we attract them to come back to New Zealand, or how do we utilise them when they're offshore better. I think that's part of the story, particularly, and Paul may want to comment, particularly given the open market we have with Australia of people being able to effectively move rather easily between both countries. And we've seen over the years some level of reciprocation between the relative perception of the economic state in one country or the other and migration. So we saw a decline in the relative shift of people to Australia during the so-called rockstar economy years. And that's happened cyclically before. But the reality is we always lose a percentage of our population, natural population increase to Australia and other places for the long term because of the nature we're a small country.
Thank you both. I'm gonna jump in and direct our attention to a question that has been coming up a little bit in the chat, and it will probably be our last question before I pass to Sir Peter to close us out for today. We've talked very briefly today around the differences between, say, Auckland and our regions, but to maybe turn more attention to that, and this might be a great question for you, Paul, is how does the demographic story for Auckland differ between, say, our metro areas and our rural areas, and what are the implications of that?
Yes, I rather regret in an interview with The Guardian, a journalist a couple of months ago, using the term hollowing out when I referred to what was happening in our regions. It is somewhat melodramatic, but it nevertheless is what's happening. And what we see around, particularly the high-income OECD countries, is that the growth of the metropolitan centres, and particularly of the primate cities, the big cities that now tend to dominate economies, think London, for example. And if we look at the last 10 years and leave aside the COVID years, what we see is that around half of our population growth is occurring in our major city. So that city is home to a third of New Zealanders. And if this continues, over the next 2 decades, it will ultimately be home to 40% of New Zealanders. However, when we look at many rural areas, and particularly those smaller centres in those rural areas, there's a paradox at the moment in that our rural economy is actually doing quite well. Our commodity prices are high. It feels economically buoyant, but when you look at the demography of those areas, then it's a very different story. We're seeing hyper-aging, which is what we referred to in the report as those areas which have more than 30% of the local population aged over 65. We see young adult out-migration, and a bit like, as Sir Peter's described, our relationship with Australia, most of them don't tend to go back to those communities. We're seeing the decline of the infrastructure in those small communities, access to a GP, increasingly difficult, recruiting a GP, increasingly difficult, access to a school, and a school that's a quality school. So I am particularly concerned at the possibility, which is what, if we take the current trends, is likely to happen, and that is that 3/4 of our population will live in the top half of the North Island, 40% in Auckland. At the moment, the only 3 regions that are growing are Auckland, Waikato, and Canterbury. And when we look at the smaller regions, places like Hawke's Bay, Nelson have actually flipped over into depopulation. And it's one of those dynamics I don't think we've paid enough attention to. And it also begs the question of what would our keeping people in place, providing the services and infrastructure. So alongside that, that positive story of economic development, of how you maintain resilience in communities and maintain the viability of those communities, I think is going to be critical.
Thank you, Paul. Team, I am conscious of time. So Peter, I will throw to you for final comments and the closing of today's webinar.
Well, look, very quickly, and there's a couple of questions I'm just going to try and answer very quickly. I think the real key issue here is this is such a fundamental issue for New Zealand's future that we need to find a way to get beyond the short-term and sometimes rather ugly political contestation that floats around issues like superannuation, migration, etc., the issues that as more of our population is non-European, the importance of investing and understanding how those people get adequate education, adequate engagement with having a positive future in New Zealand, whether they're Maori, Polynesian, Asian migrants, is going to be really important. And we proposed and we suggested in the report that we need to find some non-partisan way of getting beyond this. This is as important as anything else we do, whether it's energy strategy, environmental strategy, our human strategy for New Zealand's future. It's critical, and they're all interrelated. I mean, one of the questions asked about New Zealand's carrying capacity, which is a term I don't like, but the reality is we need to manage our population in terms of the resources we have to support it at some level. For example, are our schools placed where the population growth is? Are kids in certain parts of our population getting the education they need to be able to contribute optimally? Another question that was raised. So my final point is there are matters that are so fundamental to long-term thinking that we need to find a way with our very shallow political system to have aspects of our thinking which the policymakers become challenged or the politicians become challenged by having the informed analysis of the issue constantly put in front of them so they're challenged, whether it's a population commission, as we've suggested, whether it's a population commissioner. There's many ways it could, not many ways, but I think New Zealand's problem as a whole and why Koi 2 was set up was short-term thinking has a cost. And the cost is for everybody that it leads to short-term decision-making at the expense of the country developing. It's responsible for why we haven't had the productivity gains that all the political parties talk about needing. But again, the decisions become short-term rather than long-term. I think there's a particular challenge for Auckland, and as Paul said, for rural and provincial New Zealand. And we'll keep on working in this area, and we're going to dissect down further into specific aspects of it, like the labour market needs, obviously the impact of AI, more thinking about and more granular thinking about Auckland's future, because Auckland's more than just one urban conurbation. It's got quite a lot of variation within it. And so we thank you for your engagement. I thank Georgia, who's done a lot of the work for this for over many months, and Paul for his wisdom, and the rest of the Koi 2 team. And we would like you to keep engaged. I mean, we will continue to bring this forward as we can. We're not advocating the importance of what Koi 2 does is to bring the knowledge to the decision-making community but not to tell them what to do. It's for the society as a whole to decide what to do. It's for us to explain the problem and the options ahead. And in that regard, I've been pleased to say I've been surprised how many politicians from across the House have reflected on this report. It's been at least influential and challenged them to think about the issues. And some of them are in fact continuing to engage with us as they're forming their own thinking across the House. And we're very careful we don't pick and choose sides. So thank you very much.
Kia ora. Thank you, Peter. If you'd like to discuss how our work can help you, feel free to get in touch with us via info@informedfutures.org. Please also check out our website, follow us on LinkedIn, and if you're interested in continuing to follow our work, please do follow the link that will be sent to you after this webinar. Thank you everyone for your time today, and happy Friday.